Welcome back, everyone. Today we will be learning about organism interactions and succession. And we're going to start with ecological relationships, how different organisms interact with each other in an ecosystem. The most familiar of our relationships should be the predator-prey relationship. That's something we're all fairly used to. We see on National Geographic all the time. That's when one organism hunts and kills another one for food. We have a predator, like here I have the lion, hunting and killing the prey animal, which is the zebra. Make sure you know the difference between the predator and the prey organism. The second one that may not be quite as obvious is competition. That's when two organisms fill a similar niche and struggle over the same resources. The easiest example to see is when plants compete for sunlight. This is a huge problem in forests and is why we typically see where we have large trees in a forested area, there's very little plant life on the forest floor. Usually that area is pretty dark and reserved for things like fungus that doesn't need sunlight to grow. Um, when two organisms compete, we usually end up with competitive exclusion. That's what happens when two organisms compete for those resources until the better adapted species wins. And I've got a nice little graph here for you. These are two single-celled organisms. They're both paramecia. We have Paramecium caudatum and Paramecium aurelia. When these two are placed in the same growth medium, they will fight for those resources. They'll fight for the nutrients they need to survive. And if you look, both species are growing exponentially up until around day 4 or 5. At that time, Paramecium caudatum will hit its peak right around day 6 or so, and then start to decline. At the same time, Paramecium aurelia continues to grow exponentially up until about day 15. The reason for this is Paramecium caudatum is not as skilled at competition as Paramecium aurelia. The aurelia is a much better hunter and much better able to get the resources it needs. So even though these are single-celled organisms, the Paramecium aurelia will outcompete the caudatum until the Paramecium caudatum goes extinct from that population. This brings us to Gauss's principle. Just as we saw with our paramecium, no two species can fill the exact same niche at the same time. When two species are in the same area that fill the same niche, the one that is less fit, in this case it would have been our Paramecium caudatum, must either relocate, go to a new area where the better fit species does not exist, or die out, as our Paramecium caudatum did, or has to occupy a smaller niche, a realized niche. A great example of the realized niche is when you have a herbivorous species like an antelope living on a grassland. The antelope may be able to eat a large variety of plant species in the area, but when you bring in another herbaceous species or herbivore species that also eats more than our antelope species does, typically the antelope will start to specialize in something much smaller and only eat a couple of different varieties. And that realized niche is what we see when we look at a very biodiverse area. Aside from our competition and predator-prey, we have symbiosis. Symbiosis is when two species live together and interact. And when they do this interaction, at least one species must benefit from the relationship. There are 3 different types. We have symbiosis. We have mutualism, which is a type of symbiosis, and I've represented it here by 2 plus signs, plus plus. That's when both organisms benefit from the relationship. And in our picture here, we have a flower and a butterfly. The flower in this relationship is able to spread its pollen to other members of the same species, so it's pollinated, and the butterfly is able to get food. So both of them benefit from that relationship. And down here I have the African black rhino, which is able to provide transportation and protection for this little bird on its back. And it's also providing food. That bird is eating all of those parasites off the back of the black rhino. So while the rhino is being cleaned, the bird is able to eat. Both of them benefit. Our second example is parasitism. That is represented by the plus minus. In this situation, one organism benefits and the second organism is harmed. Usually, a good parasite does not kill its host. It's usually only harmed in some way. The example I have up top is a very important one for you to remember. The larger bird there is actually a chick. It's a cuckoo bird. And the cuckoo bird is considered a parasite because the mother cuckoo lays her eggs in other birds' nests. In this case, that is a warbler. The cuckoo will hatch early before the warbler's eggs hatch and then push all of the other eggs out of the nest so that it's the only chick in that nest. The warbler, when she comes back, we're not sure why, but the warbler does not treat the cuckoo chick any different than she would her own chicks. So she spends all of her energy getting food and raising this baby cuckoo bird. In this instance, the cuckoo benefits because it doesn't have to spend its own energy raising its chicks, and the warbler is damaged or harmed because its own chicks are killed, so its own reproductive success is threatened. Our second example here is a plant example. This green plant is mistletoe. Mistletoe is green, it is photosynthetic, but it gets a large amount of its nutrients from its host tree, in this case the silver birch. It grows very high in the treetops and is able to dig its roots underneath the bark of its host tree and steal nutrients. Our third type of symbiosis is commensalism, represented by a +0. This is where one organism benefits and the second isn't benefited, but it's not harmed either. The example here, this is a bird's nest fern. In comparison to the mistletoe, this bird's nest fern will grow on the side of a tree, but it doesn't steal nutrients from the tree. It basically just stays there. The benefit to the bird's nest fern is that it's able to get higher to the canopy so that it gets more sunlight. And it doesn't hurt the tree by being there, but it doesn't really help it either. And down here I have the humpback whale. The humpback whale with barnacles attached over it. The barnacles get a stable place to live and transportation, but they do not hurt the whale by living on its skin. There's no real harm. I've organized these into a little chart for you. The biggest mistake people make is they want to put the bottom three, mutualism, parasitism, and commensalism, up here with predator-prey and competition. But you should know that all three of these are examples of symbiosis. So make sure you understand this organizational pattern, that there are three ecological relationships and that symbiosis has three examples. Part 2 today is going to be on succession. Succession is the change in species composition in an area that usually occurs after some type of major disturbance. Could be a forest fire, a lava flow, or a major flood. It also refers to the new establishment of a community on previously barren land, areas that didn't have anything growing. There are two different types, and we're going to start with primary succession. In this case, succession begins in a completely lifeless area and an area without any soil, a soilless area. The two examples that you need to know are lava flows. A volcano erupts and lays down a new layer of rock with absolutely no soil, or receding glaciers. Glaciers tend to scrape the surface of the earth and take with them all the soil components, so you're left with bare rock when they finally do recede. Primary succession is accomplished by a pioneer species. Pioneer, just like the human pioneers into the out west or old west, are the first ones to arrive. And primary is done with lichen. Lichen is a symbiotic relationship between algae and fungus, and it creates this endosymbiotic organism. We'll learn more about that later. It grows on the surface of rocks and on the surface of trees. I know you've seen it before, even if you didn't know what to call it. This is all this gray, greenish gray patch is lichen. As it breaks down and dies, it will also break down that rock and eventually, over a very long period of time, forms a very thin soil. Secondary succession happens when a major disturbance kills off all the plants and animals in an area but leaves the soil intact. So for secondary succession to occur, we have to have soil. Two biggest examples here are a forest fire that kills everything, or a major flood that's going to wipe everything out. Here we have a pioneer species that is much larger. In this case, we have an annual weed. These are small plants. Over time, these are replaced by perennial weeds. Annuals are plants that only grow for one season and then produce seeds and then die. Perennials grow and live throughout the wintertime. They live all year long. They may die back, but the same plant will grow. Eventually, we'll have an invasion of pine. Pine is a very fast-growing tree. It's a softwood and easily outcompetes the perennial plants around it for sunlight. But at the same time, I've got insects and animals that are carrying in other seeds, and in this example we have a mature hardwood, probably something like a maple. A maple is much better adapted to a temperate forest region and is able to outcompete the pine forest for sunlight, but it takes a very long time. Maples are very slow growing. So in this example, I've got 150 years later, we have a mature hardwood forest. The final stage of succession is called our climax community. This is where everything is stable. All the biotic and abiotic factors in the ecosystem are left, and we have very little change over a long period of time. Here you can see a forest community. There are some plants growing on the forest floor. This is probably early spring, where the leaves are not completely out, so we do have quite a bit of sunlight reaching the forest floor. And it looks like I have a mixture here of dogwoods, maples, and poplars. Succession happens because of three different principles. We have tolerance. This is when late successional species are unaffected by the earlier stages. So my maples are not really harmed by my pine trees being there, and my perennial plants don't really care if the annual plants were there to begin with. They can grow just fine whether or not they exist, the annuals existed. Facilitation is extremely important. This is when an early species changes the environment to make it more hospitable for others. This is what the lichen does. Lichens and moss go in and establish life on places where there was no soil, there was no life. And by living and dying and breaking down rock, they build up soil that can then allow ferns and grasses and other small plants to take root and live. And then we have inhibition. This is when early species hinder the establishment and growth of other species. The example here is the red maple again. Red maples release a toxic substance from its root system that makes it impossible for other plants to grow around the maple. So this is a competitive advantage. It forces other plants to live outside of the maple's area so that it can keep all the sunlight and all the nutrients and all the water for itself, but it also inhibits further succession. And finally, we need to know, can we predict succession? And the big point here is there's not really a clear, sequential, predictable successionary process. All these animals and plants are going to work together in different ways to make a constantly changing mosaic of vegetation in different stages. So it's not like I can look at a forest and say in 150 years it's going to look like this. I can't go to a lava flow and say, well, in 50 years this is going to have this particular kind of grass growing. It's all kind of up in the air, and it changes as we go. So we have to study succession as it happens. And finally, there is an ongoing struggle by different species for food and habitat and nutrients and reproductive strategies and advantages over another. So this ongoing struggle is going to lead us to all kinds of different avenues. New niches will open up and other niches will close down. So as we look at these ecosystems, keep in mind that everything is very mutable, very changeable, and nothing is completely set in stone. And that's it for succession. Be ready to look at different succession examples in class tomorrow.